What is going on? Welcome to the channel. So today I want to talk to you about T2. They did drop their preliminary earnings. So I will have a very big advocate for T2. His name is Taylor. I'm going to drop his link to his Twitter in the comments below. So I highly suggest popping over there to give him a follow. But Taylor, appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Cal. I appreciate it.
So yeah, pretty casual conversation. What is your initial thoughts of, I guess, what they dropped?
Yeah, unfortunately, the call that the CEO, John Sperzel and the CFO, John Sprague, hosted on Thursday was pretty concise. It felt pretty scripted, although there was some fumbling a lot around that John Sprague did. Not knowing the updated outstanding shares was eyebrow raising to me. I don't know if that was, some sort of dramatic effect that the company is doing to make it sound less scripted. But they only had one analyst, the Canaccord Genuity analyst, Ben, available for Q&A. And I know for a fact that just from hosting space calls over the past few months that there's a lot more questions from investors than Ben had represented. And over the course of the last 4 years now, coming up in March, that I've been invested or involved in this company, I know that that is not the I guess precedent that the company has had before. There's been a lot more. I shouldn't say a lot more, but definitely more than one analyst that's been able to ask questions. So over the last two earnings, that's kind of been Ben leading those Q&As and not, I guess, giving an accurate representation of all of the questions that investors have among the pipeline and things. So my general thoughts are, initially, I was hosting the call live, so anyone can really get a gut reaction of how I felt about the call. Listening to that space call, I was quite frustrated at Sperzel's lack of forward guidance regarding the biothreat panel that has been commercialized for going on 6 months. Didn't give any hard revenue estimates, timeline for demand, despite months ago before the reverse split saying that the biothreat panel was developed by T2, funded by the government for the government. And so 6 months later, to not have any purchase orders or guidance is baffling. I don't necessarily think that this is like an insidious thing, that nobody wants it, but I do think that they are keeping details under wraps more than what we are seeing at the surface level.
Yeah, the
And
weird
that's
sense is during the recent Q3 earnings, I did tune into that one. And I kind of I that's the sense I got during the Q3 earnings. Of course, a lot has happened since then, but I got that same sense of the fact that there was something that they were kind of holding back on. So maybe it's just things take time, right? So I get your viewpoint on that, and I do agree. Based
yeah,
on some of the numbers
no,
that they put out, like I feel like they do need to do something sooner rather than later because 15.7 million cash equivalents isn't all that much.
no, that's like, that's why people keep throwing out bankruptcy, because anyone who's been following their burn rate understands that 15 million is about a quarter of burn rate. They've been burning 5 to 10 million, depending on the month, So I think Dilution Tracker has them at like 4.7 million right now. They disclosed the 15 million that was as of December 31st, right? We're sitting mid-February now, so that does make sense. So it's kind of odd to me, Spursel, I'm checking my phone because I have the T2 and website pulled up here with their actual PR, because I don't know if Spursel was very clear, or as clear as I would have appreciated as an investor regarding this new debt to equity conversion with CRG, right? He mentions a shareholder meeting in April. Um, we don't have cash to get to April. I
Yeah.
mean, we have cash to get to March. So where's this cash coming from? And to say, oh, well, that's why the company's going bankrupt. Well, you have to read between the lines a bit as an investor, right? Because if their creditor is decreasing the loan covenant and the loan maturity, extending the loan maturity out to December of 2025 and reducing the cash covenant from 5 million down to 500,000, this isn't in alignment with a creditor that wants to call a loan and accelerate a bankruptcy process, right?
Of course, yeah.
Um, if a creditor wanted to accelerate that process, they could have done that years ago, multiple times. So there's a misalignment with their creditor who is, directly involved with the bankruptcy process and an actual bankruptcy, outcome here. So then as the investor, you're kind of tasked with reading between the lines and speculating, which is risky, which is tough. But I would say this, I would say if the shareholder meeting is, for this debt to equity conversion is in April, and we don't have enough cash to get there, it means one of two things. More dilution via the ATM that they have already set up with Canaccord. We know they have access to at least 30 million in cash, which would certainly put them past April. Obviously, that's not great for common shareholder equity. Or option two is kind of the way that I was leaning, is some sort of transaction, some sort of merger acquisition, some sort of partnership, whether that's a buyout, reverse merger, straight up merger, I don't know. So then you take those two possibilities, right? More dilution or a buyout. And which one do you choose? And this is where my post this past week, where I thought more of a buyout was, well, why didn't they dilute with the ATM? Why why reduce debt, which is great for the balance sheet, but does nothing really for their runway besides maybe decreasing interest expenses, right?
Yeah.
So then I think, okay, well, are there new sales that are in the pipeline that we're just not being, privy to? Is there more demand for BioThreat than we think? Are they anticipating increased utilization of their current sepsis panels with this new Acinetobacter baumannii, bacteria that can now be detected? I don't know. I think that would be quite risky for the company to speculate on those things, given, less than a month or two of cash flow. And if there aren't
And
contracts signed already.
and sorry, you mentioned about I think you mentioned it in one of your Twitter spaces before, but who would, if there would be a merger or a potential takeover, who do you think some of the likely candidates would be?
Yeah, great question. We've speculated. I don't think there's actually a shortage of people. The biotech space is loaded with companies that are looking to expand their revenue potential. There's a lot of billion-dollar companies out there, but I think where you would start is in biotech. You have like the diagnostic side, and then you have the therapeutic side, right?
Yeah.
And some companies kind of go both ways on that. But I would say since T2 is more of a diagnostic company, it would make more sense to start with, the billion-dollar companies that are more tailored to diagnosis. So the first one that comes to mind is Danaher, right? Danaher is, I believe, headquartered in Washington, D.C., I believe. Very close, right, to our
Yeah.
White House. And they have, oh, I'm kind of pulling from memory here. I think they have over $8 billion of cash on hand that is available for any sort of buyout or merger acquisition that they would look for. The reason why I think Danaher in particular out of anyone is because they are looking to expand their sepsis portfolio.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm forgetting the name of one of their, I think they have a technology that is currently being pushed. That's it's a monocyte distribution width, I think, is one of their products that deal in the sepsis realm. And I think that would pair perfectly with T2's system, because the monocyte distribution width product doesn't diagnose sepsis. It does not have any pathogen specificity, but it is a fantastic marker or screening product to see if a patient might be at risk for a hyper autoimmune response, which would be the sepsis response. So I think that paired with T2's hyper-specific and hypersensitive bacteria and Candida panels would be great, because it's one, we can detect up to 1 CFU at T2. And just because you detect one colony forming unit, one little bacteria or pathogen in the blood, does not mean a patient necessarily has a sepsis syndrome. And that's where you have to look at the clinical picture. Is the patient febrile? Do they have abnormal vitals? Are they presenting to you sick? In that scenario, paired with a pathogen in their bloodstream, certainly you would think bacteremia, sepsis. But what you really want is some sort of objective systemic inflammatory marker to tell you, is there an autoimmune response or a hyped up immune response occurring in this patient who also has a pathogen in their bloodstream. So for that reason, I think it would pair in tandem with it almost perfectly and drive uptake of their, right? It's like a synergistic product for them. It would drive revenue for the utilization of MDW, the monocyte distribution with, and their own T2 product if they were to acquire it. So that would be one option. They have the cash on hand and it fits their portfolio. Another company that I was thinking and others were thinking of would be Thermo Fisher. Thermo Fisher was one that I thought of and others had thought of because they currently kind of delve into the Lyme diagnostic space. I think that they own potentially, and I might be wrong on this, but I think that they dive into the diagnostic realm of Lyme through their 𝗖𝗧, ELISA, immunoassay product. But if you are a clinician and you're listening to this, you realize that this diagnostic doesn't really help you clinically because it takes days to weeks to result. And the CDC guideline right now for treating Lyme is basically, if you have a clinical suspicion, if the patient is presenting with a rash that is consistent with what is called erythema migrans, which is a bullseye rash, then it's up to you to decide whether you should start treatment in this patient, which then the current treatment standard of care is at least 1 to 2, if not up to 4 weeks of twice a day doxycycline orally as an outpatient. And so you can imagine that if you get it wrong as a clinician and you're putting this patient on 2 to 4 weeks of antibiotics, you can be causing some serious harm in that patient, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
So I think, that T2 Lyme, which 𝗪𝗠 had mentioned, they are trying to get commercialized through the LDT laboratory developed test pathway currently in 2024, would be a perfect product for Thermo Fisher to acquire, for, to not pair with 𝗖𝗧, but actually replace it, I think. And this is a multiple billion-dollar niche just in Lyme itself. And they also have, I think, over 5 billion cash on hand for any sort of acquisition.
Yeah, 8.8.
So
I was
those
just checking
would
that.
be
So yeah, they have quite a
my
lot.
first. Oh, are you? Okay, yeah. And I did some research on Danaher and Thermo, and Thermo tends to spend more money on average for their acquisitions. I believe on average their acquisitions are over $1 billion per acquisition, whereas Danaher, I think it tends towards the average of closer to 500 to 750 million. So I would prefer Thermo would buy us if they tend to splash some more cash towards that. But frankly, either one would be great for not just investors but patients around the world.
And so I have a question. So logically, I think T2's market cap is roughly like 25, 30 mil right now. What would you logically feel is a fair, appropriate takeover price?
It's a great question, and it's kind of a nuanced answer. So I apologize if it's not straight up. Well, to be concise, I think that when I first entered into this investment and read about the technology and its potential, I immediately assigned this $1 billion valuation or more in my head. And back then, I think the company was trading closer to 100 or 200 million. So the upside was significant, but nowhere
Yeah.
as significant as it is currently at this undervaluation of, 10 to 30 million. So how do you value companies? It depends on how you value companies, right? Some people value companies based on profit multiples. Some people base it on a EBITDA multiples. Some people place it on forward revenue multiples, right? Well, in a biotech space, a lot of those companies are not profitable, right? But they're getting bought out. So they're not being valued based on profit or EBITDA multiples. It tends to be revenue multiples, not even revenue today, but revenue tomorrow, right? So it's difficult because current revenue for the quarter was below 2 million, right? It's peas. It's kind of embarrassing, if you will, based on our potential. And I think yearly revenue was around 10 or something like that. And I think the estimates for next year are 10 to 12 million, right? So to call this $1 billion company, looking at that revenue, that's why I'm getting, people looking at me and commenting, saying that I'm crazy and a pumper or anything like that. But you have to understand that if you're a clinician, it almost comes naturally to you to understand that once something becomes gold standard in the medical community, there is no going back. And if it is going to change, it's going to take decades because that's just the way the medical community is. We move slow, we grow slow. It takes a ton of convincing people who've been practicing for decades to change their ways, even if it's based on up-to-date research. It's actually why there's so much harm in the medical field, because just people are slow to change their ways and follow the updated research. So immediately I looked at this company and I thought, okay, there's a strong potential here for their sepsis product to become gold standard over current blood cultures, which have been the gold standard for, I think, 40 plus years, which is astounding to think about, especially given the fact that their sensitivity on blood cultures is like less than 70%. It's really not great. And it takes days to give you a confirmed result with resistance susceptibility testing. So once the next generation product for T2 is commercialized, and next generation, I mean the T2 resistance panel paired with the bacteria and Candida panels that can detect more than 95% of sepsis causing pathogens. That next generation, that's where you're going to get all of the revenue and the valuation of this company. Now, I've said in the spaces that I've hosted that you may never actually see that revenue as an investor in T2, because if you think about it, if T2 gets to a point where their product can displace blood cultures and can displace ELISA panels for Lyme detection, they don't need a buyout anymore, because their organic revenue from hospital utilization is going to be exponential to the point where they're going to be able to organically grow and fund their growth and expand their business on their own. And if you're a Danaher or a Thermo or some other company that is in sepsis or Lyme or bioterrorism, that's significant market share that T2 could potentially take away from you. So you have to think on their end, it's almost game theory, right? Like, can they afford to allow T2 to get to this next generation before acquiring them? Because once they're through that next generation, there may not, you may go to ask them if you want to buy them, and the company might be in a position where they can actually say no. But right now, with $5 million left in the bank account, they're not in the position to turn away bidders, right? So then the question becomes, have they already gotten offers that 𝗪𝗠 and the board have turned down? I think that's probably the case. I can't imagine a company like Danaher or Thermo looking at this, looking at a negative 99% drop in share price in 5 years and not seeing an opportunity to acquire a company that might be able to add billions to your future revenue for pennies on the dollar, right? And so that's where I'm so convicted that ultimately this ends in a buyout or merger acquisition rather than an organic growth pathway.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And when I did listen to your space, I was in agreement. The only thing that when I guess I immediately didn't see it, and again, I didn't really listen to their recent earnings, but about expansion, I don't understand why they would be expanding to Europe and Asia if they had buyout. Like, I don't know. Obviously, you still have to continue day-to-day processes and operations. You can't just cease everything. That's the only thing that didn't really rub me the right way that would coincide with the whole takeover kind of
Sure.
scenario. But
No, that you know what, that is a fantastic insight, and I think that's actually a hesitation that not just yourself or I might have, but a ton of investors out there might have. Why isn't right? I mean, we I don't know where you're from. I live in America. Most Americans think that they're the best and they live in the best country, and so if there's a technology that isn't being utilized by America, but Singapore, they might poo-poo it a little bit. Um, I think the one worded answer to your question would be the FDA, right? So T2 resistance is currently CE marked in Europe, meaning it can be commercialized in Europe. And I actually believe that's why you have an increased utilization of this panel in international countries rather than America. Because I've said this multiple times on my space calls, and this is where I play devil's advocate, like truly, if I was a director of a lab or the chief financial officer at a major hospital system and a T2 salesman came to me and said, hey, here's this tech that we have. Would you like to buy it? And I would say this is fantastic. I see the future potential of this, but here's the cold hard facts. Because you can only detect, and I say only, but because you only can detect 75% of sepsis causing pathogens, and you don't have the ability to give me susceptibility with that, I cannot discharge my patient from the hospital with a negative T2 test, which means I have to still get blood cultures and wait for that result. What does that mean? It doesn't change the patient outcome most of the time. And this could then become an added expense for the hospital, right? To pay for this T2 technology, for it to not lead to, changed outcomes right away. So in the near term, it actually might even hurt the financials of a hospital. But any prudent, I guess executive in a hospital that sees the long-term potential of T2 would be jumping on this because they understand that this is the future. And although I might have to suffer some short-term pain in terms of added expenses, I'm going to be a first adopter, and it's going to lead to better patient outcomes in the future when the next generation of this technology is available for my patients, which then is going to lead to decreased hospitalization length. It's going to lead to decreased, potentially, I should say, iatrogenic complications. And iatrogenic is a medical term for things caused by providers, right? And this would be like kidney injury from vancomycin, right? That'd be like giving a patient an IV antibiotic that they might not have needed, and then you give them an acute kidney injury, and then they have to stay in the hospital longer. Oh, and then maybe they get sick in the hospital because they were there too long and they picked up an infection. This is a nightmare, and this is an everyday occurrence in the American hospital system and global hospital system. So to get back to your question of why is there more international uptake than domestic uptake in the United States, I think it has to do with the lack of the T2 resistance panel right now and that availability to hospital systems, because you can't change the antibiotic right away in a patient that, let's say a patient comes in with an infection and they test positive for Staph aureus on the T2 bacteria panel within 3 to 5 hours. You're like, awesome, I have a result. I'm going to start IV vancomycin. But I still have to wait 2 to 3 days to see if there is any sort of bacterial resistance to this vancomycin because of the blood culture result. Well, 3 days later, you get a result that says this patient has VRE, vancomycin resistance. Now you have to change the antibiotic. Well, if you had T2 resistance available from day one, you would have known that you didn't have to, that you couldn't have used vancomycin and that you had to use an alternative antimicrobial, right? And so really, I've said this multiple times, the T2 resistance panel is really a linchpin when it comes to domestic uptake of T2's pipeline right now.
That's a good point. I honestly did not think of it that way. And
Well,
actually,
there's no reason you should have unless you're a medical provider, man. I mean, this stuff is so nuanced.
yeah, and actually that's why I like listening to you. You do give that because when I'm pretty good at technicals, I'm good at reading balance sheets and
Yep.
incorporating shorts. I think that's what's the trifecta that lured me to T2 is the likelihood of a short squeeze plus this new FDA approval, like big thing that was just being unveiled. It was getting a lot of hype. Just luckily enough, there's a lot of individuals like you that are able to break it down on most of what you said, in all honesty, is over my head. I'm trusting that
Sure.
what you're saying is
Yeah, and I'm talking fast too, and I'm not used to interviewing, and so like those who are listening will probably have to go back and rewind and listen to this again. And I'm happy to break down some more medical things if we need to. But unfortunately, that like that's why I'm so outspoken here is because I realize that most people are actually much better than I when it comes to interpreting a balance sheet or even like a short squeeze potential or any of these things. But where my my specialty comes from, I worked in the ER for 3 years, and I worked in the ICU, worked in surgical suites, I worked on oncology suites, and that is where this is being used. So I got really lucky on that end.
and to play devil's advocate, because I don't know if you've ever watched or anything, but I always like to play same as you, it sounds like. At what stage do you think that it could be potentially the management that is holding T2 back?
Holding them back on purpose or just through like incompetence?
I would say incompetence, but yeah,
Yeah. No, I mean, you look at John Spurzl doesn't really have credentials that would wow me in getting this technology, globally,
I kind of noticed that, yeah.
what I'm saying? Like he played football in college. He was a CEO of ChemBio before this, did not do well there, had a lawsuit with ChemBio trying to even get his options after he left the company. He had sepsis. That's basically his claim to fame at this company. So I think that is a large component of why you're not seeing the revenue that you even should see at our current stage. I mean, 10 million in revenue with our current pipeline, not even next gen, is laughable. And honestly, I mean, COVID actually had a lot to do with this, I think. COVID really limited the ability of salespeople to get into hospitals and pitch their technology if it wasn't something that that the hospital needed that day. So,
Yeah,
and we all
no.
know that happened in 2020. And they had to switch routes. And I think that they even made a poor management decision. Like they went for this COVID panel. Is like, what are you guys doing? There's so much supply of COVID panels. We don't need a COVID panel. Focus on our current pipeline. I think that they should have taken that time to focus on the development of their line panel. But time passes and it's hindsight 2020.
Yeah, no kidding. I guess all in all, what is your expectations for instance, this upcoming quarter? And again, I'll definitely have you on if people
Sure.
And plus, anyone watching, if you guys have any questions for Taylor, either go to his Twitter, give him a follow there, or drop a comment in the description below, and you can definitely go over that. But what's your expectations for this upcoming quarter?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. And a lot of us really were kind of left with our hands in the air. What is going to happen this next quarter? Um, we know that the Lyme phase 2 was completed, and we were a winner of that. There was indications of the Alexander Cohen Foundation that there was going to be a phase 3 potentially. So I would say, during this quarter, there's probably going to be some grinding, getting through maybe the next steps of a possible phase 3 on that accelerator competition to get Lyme commercialized. We know that Spurzl said that his goal was to get that done in 2024. T2 Resistance is currently undergoing a Duke study alongside Abbott products, 𝗪𝗎 products, so multiple billion-dollar companies, and then you have this little $10 million company down here. That study, is supposed to finish up some point this year, and they want to get that submitted in Q3. So honestly, this quarter, really, there's not a whole lot besides just advancing this pipeline, increasing utilization of their current panels, getting new placements of their T2DX instruments, hopefully, I think would be a big priority of the company. And then getting some freaking contracts for this biothreat panel, I think would be a fantastic. I mean, we every other day in the news, you see a new conflict coming, like Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Russia, extreme risk of bioterrorism in any of those conflicts. And so I would imagine that they're probably going to try and get some revenue from that.
Hopefully. Yeah, no, that's what one thing I was wanting to pick your brain about is about, I guess, the short-term futures, because the market is brutal right now, and
Brutal,
you need
brutal.
a company to give a justified reason for investors to hold on. If there's no catalyst in the short term, you're going to have people panic selling. You have also shorts behind the scenes that's trying to manipulate and whatever. So it's a very fickle time, and you need to have all your ducks in a row. If not, you're going to be, especially in T2s, like we already kind of talked on about the burn rate and essentially dilution possibly even occurring this quarter, early next quarter. Like
Mm.
it, hopefully the company does come up with something sooner rather than later. But that a lot of your same concerns that you brought up were the same ones that I kind of noticed as well. And I think this is why you've been getting the extreme volatility with the stock price. Um,
I
it's
agree.
yeah,
Right now, this security is priced for bankruptcy. Let me just be fully honest with you. There's no reason why a company that pulls in 10 million of revenue should be valued at 20 million when they have multiple FDA cleared products, new products on the pipeline, and a creditor that is actively decreasing covenants and extending loans, right? I mean, this is like a complete divergence from reality of the stock price. So I do think that the market is currently valuing this security for either delisting from the Nasdaq, or straight up bankruptcy. But what doesn't make any sense to that is their creditor is, again, I sound like a broken record, but this is a major piece of the puzzle here. Their creditor is deciding to take equity in a company that's supposed to get delisted. $15 million of equity in a company that might go to the OTC. How would they exit that if they go to the OTC? What liquidity would be in the OTC that would allow them to recoup 15 million of their investment? And why would they do that when they could just mature the loan and take their cash on hand? They own they own a lien on the patent of NMR, meaning they can literally accelerate the loan whenever they could have. Now they can't because they extended it, but they could have accelerated that loan, taken that patent and stripped it for parts. And there's precedent for companies or creditors doing that in the past. Why haven't they done that? And I think the simple answer to that is because I think CRG sees a similar opportunity that I do. I think that they see that they can turn $15 million and the previous 10 million that they invested into multiples, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. So Taylor, I appreciate you coming on. I did talk on quite a lot of the recent events, and hopefully people will get a good grasp of maybe where T2 might be going. So Taylor,
Yeah,
appreciate you
no,
coming on.
I appreciate your time, and if we get like a lot of questions or people liking this and wanting to come back on, I'm happy to do that. So I appreciate it.